There is a certain kind of person who never raises their voice yet still manages to control an entire room with nothing but silence. No shouting happens, no cruel words are spoken, but somehow the temperature in the conversation drops several degrees the moment they go quiet. Most people assume silence is simply the absence of communication, a neutral pause between two people who simply have nothing left to say. But the truth is far darker than that, because for certain people silence is not empty at all, it is a weapon they sharpen. They have learned that withholding a response can hurt someone far more deeply than any insult could ever manage to accomplish in words. Today we are going to decode the psychology of people who manipulate through silence and why their quiet feels louder than any scream. First, we need to understand what silence actually does to the human brain, because the answer explains why this tactic works so well. Psychologist Kipling Williams spent decades studying a phenomenon called ostracism, the deliberate act of excluding or ignoring another person without explanation or warning. His research found that being ignored activates the same regions of the brain that process actual physical pain, specifically the anterior cingulate cortex. In other words, the brain does not experience silence as neutral, it experiences deliberate silence as an actual injury, almost like a physical wound. This is why being ignored by someone you love can feel unbearable. Your nervous system genuinely believes it is under some kind of threat. Manipulators who use silence, consciously or not, are exploiting this ancient wiring, because they know a wound like this rarely heals in silence. Researchers call this social pain, and studies show it can register in the brain almost identically to the pain of a broken bone. That is why a simple, unanswered message can spiral into hours of anxious rumination, your mind treating the silence like an emergency signal. So where does this behavior actually come from? And why do some people reach for silence instead of simply saying what they truly feel? For some, this pattern was learned very early, inside homes where raising your voice led to punishment, so silence became the safer option available. A child who watched their parents disappear emotionally for days after conflict absorbed an unspoken lesson that withdrawal is how power gets expressed. As that child grew into an adult, they carried the same script forward, using distance as their primary tool whenever they feel threatened. For others, the root is far less innocent, tracing instead into patterns psychologists associate with narcissistic and manipulative interpersonal control strategies overall. Researchers studying coercive control note that withholding communication can function as a deliberate strategy to punish, destabilize, and quietly dominate another person entirely. Some people discover early that words can be argued with, but silence cannot, because there is nothing concrete left for anyone to challenge. This makes silence a nearly perfect tool for control, since it leaves no evidence, no quote to point back to, no clear accusation possible. Let us break down the clearest signs of someone who manipulates through silence, starting with the most obvious pattern almost everyone eventually recognizes clearly. Sign 1. Silence as punishment, where affection is suddenly withdrawn the moment you say or do something they personally did not approve of doing. There is no argument, no explanation offered, just a sudden icy distance that appears without warning and lingers until you finally apologize first. This tactic forces you to guess endlessly what went wrong, replaying every sentence you said, desperately searching for the invisible line you crossed accidentally. The message underneath this silence is simple yet devastating. Your behavior determines whether love continues to flow or disappears completely without any discussion. Sign 2. Silence as leverage, where they refuse to respond until you crack first and reach out with an apology you may not even owe. Psychologists call this a demand-withdraw pattern, where one person pursues connection while the other retreats, creating an unbalanced and exhausting power dynamic overall. Over time, you learn that peace only returns when you surrender first, training your nervous system to associate their silence with your own guilt. This is rarely about resolving the actual disagreement. It is about establishing who holds control over when conversation resumes and who caves first. Sign 3. Silence as narrative control, where they refuse to explain their withdrawal, leaving you to fill in the blanks with your own fear. Without an explanation, your mind manufactures stories, usually blaming yourself, because uncertainty feels unbearable and self-blame at least offers a sense of closure. This is precisely the intended effect, because a person who controls the silence also controls the story you tell yourself about what happened. You begin narrating their intentions for them, softening their behavior in your own head, because the alternative explanation feels too painful to fully accept. Sign 4. Silence as emotional flooding disguised as control, which is more complicated, because sometimes withdrawal is not manipulation but genuine psychological overwhelm entirely. Relationship researcher John Gottman found that during intense conflict, some people experience diffuse physiological arousal, where heart rate spikes and rational thinking shuts down. In this state, stonewalling is not a calculated weapon but a nervous system in genuine crisis, unable to process another single word of conflict. Gottman's research found this heart rate can climb above 100 beats per minute, essentially flooding the brain until productive conversation becomes physically impossible. The difference matters enormously, because manipulative silence is chosen and maintained deliberately, while flooding-related silence is involuntary and often deeply distressing internally too. Sign 5, silence used to test loyalty, where they go quiet specifically to observe whether you will chase them or simply walk away instead. If you pursue them relentlessly, it confirms in their mind that you need them more than they need you, reinforcing their private sense of control. If you do not chase them, they may escalate the silence further, treating your calm response as evidence that you no longer truly care. This creates an exhausting loop where you can never win, because both chasing and not chasing seem to somehow prove their private narrative correct. Sign 6, the return performance, where after days of silence they suddenly reappear as if nothing happened, offering warmth without any real accountability shown. This sudden switch can feel disorienting, because your body is still holding tension from the withdrawal while they behave as though it never occurred. Psychologists sometimes describe this oscillation between coldness and warmth as intermittent reinforcement, a pattern known to strengthen emotional attachment rather than weaken it over time. The unpredictability itself becomes addictive. Your brain releases relief and gratitude when warmth returns, making you cling tighter to avoid future silence again. Sign 7, silence used as public performance, where they go quiet specifically in front of others to embarrass you or shift sympathy toward themselves. A shared dinner turns tense the instant they stop speaking, and suddenly you are the one over-explaining to friends why the mood feels heavy. This turns a private conflict into a public spectacle, quietly positioning you as the difficult one while they play the wounded, silent victim instead. Sign 8, digital silence, where messages are left on read for hours or days, turning a phone screen into another quiet battlefield for control. The 3 small dots that appear and disappear without a reply can trigger genuine anxiety, because uncertainty in digital spaces feels somehow even more unbearable. Researchers studying ostracism have found that even brief digital exclusion, like being left on read, activates measurable stress responses in most people studied. So what happens to a person who lives on the receiving end of this pattern for months or even years without understanding what is happening? Their nervous system slowly adapts, becoming hyper-aware of tone, timing, and mood, constantly scanning for the earliest signs of the silence returning again soon. They may start apologizing reflexively, even for things that were never truly their fault, simply to avoid triggering another exhausting round of painful withdrawal. Over time, this erodes their sense of self, because they begin outsourcing their own worth to whether the silent partner approves of them today. They may even start rehearsing conversations in their head before speaking, editing every sentence in advance just to avoid the risk of another shutdown. This constant self-editing is exhausting, and it slowly teaches a person to shrink their own voice just to keep the peace intact somehow. Understanding this pattern is the first step toward breaking free from it, because clarity removes the fog that manipulation quietly depends on to survive. Here is the most important reframe. Silence used this way is not a form of communication. It is a refusal to communicate on purpose. Healthy people can absolutely need space during conflict, but they say so clearly, offering a time frame instead of disappearing without any explanation whatsoever given. The presence of an explanation is the difference between a boundary and a punishment, between self-care and control disguised as simple emotional regulation instead. So how can someone recognize the difference and respond in a way that protects their own mental and emotional well-being going forward from here? First, learn to name the pattern the moment it appears, rather than immediately assuming you did something that deserves this cold treatment today. Silently ask yourself whether an explanation was offered, because the absence of one is often the clearest signal that punishment is the real intention. Naming the pattern out loud, even quietly to yourself, interrupts the automatic spiral of self-blame that manipulative silence is specifically designed to trigger. Second, resist the urge to chase immediately, because chasing teaches the other person that withdrawal remains an effective and reliable way to control you. Instead, calmly state that you are available to talk whenever they are ready, then return your attention to your own life and responsibilities fully. This is not coldness in return, it is simply refusing to participate in a dynamic where your peace depends entirely on someone else's mood. Third, set a clear and spoken boundary around communication, explaining that disagreements will be discussed rather than punished, with days of total silence instead. A boundary might sound like this: I am willing to talk through conflict, but I cannot continue a relationship built around disappearing acts instead. State the boundary once, calmly and clearly, then let your actions demonstrate it consistently rather than repeating the same explanation over and over again. Fourth, seek support outside the relationship, whether from friends, family, or a licensed therapist, because isolation makes this pattern significantly harder to see clearly. Manipulative silence often thrives in isolation, since outside perspective can help you separate your own self-worth from someone else's chosen method of control. A trusted friend can offer a mirror you cannot give yourself, reflecting back patterns that feel invisible when you are standing too close to them. Fifth, learn to soothe your own nervous system while waiting, using grounding techniques instead of endlessly refreshing your phone for a reply that may come. Simple breathing exercises, short walks, or even naming what you physically feel in your body can interrupt the anxious loop that silence tends to create. This does not mean ignoring the pain. It means refusing to let someone else's silence dictate every single minute of your emotional state today. It is also worth remembering that not everyone who goes quiet is manipulating you. Sometimes silence really is overwhelm rather than a calculated strategy. The difference lies in the pattern over time. One instance of needing space is human. A repeated cycle used to control you is not. Watch for consistency. Does an explanation eventually follow? Does accountability ever appear? Or does the silence simply repeat itself every single time conflict arises? Sign 9. Silence used inside families, where a parent or sibling stops speaking to a relative for weeks after a disagreement over something minor. This tactic often gets inherited across generations, since children who watch a parent weaponize silence tend to unconsciously repeat the exact same pattern later. Family estrangement research shows that unexplained emotional cutoffs can leave lasting confusion, since the excluded person rarely receives a clear reason for the sudden distance. Sign 10. Silence used at work, where a colleague or manager stops responding to messages after a disagreement, quietly punishing you through professional isolation instead. This can feel especially destabilizing because your livelihood is involved, making the power imbalance created by silence even sharper than in personal relationships alone. Sign 11. Silence used as a reward withheld, where warmth and praise only return once you have proven your loyalty through visible, exhausting effort. This teaches you to perform constantly for approval, turning the relationship into an unspoken audition rather than a place where you can simply exist. Sign 12. Selective silence, where they respond instantly to trivial topics but suddenly go quiet the moment a serious or vulnerable subject is raised. This selective pattern reveals the truth. The silence is not about being overwhelmed. It is a chosen tool used only when accountability becomes inconvenient. Now that we understand these 12 signs clearly, it becomes easier to see why this pattern feels so uniquely painful compared to open conflict. Open conflict, however uncomfortable, still offers information, while silence offers nothing except an empty space your own anxious mind is forced to fill. Psychologists note that ambiguity is often harder for the brain to tolerate than clear rejection because uncertainty keeps the nervous system on constant alert. This explains why some people say they would rather be yelled at than ignored, since at least yelling provides something concrete to respond to. Understanding this helps explain why silence, used deliberately, can be more psychologically damaging over time than a single heated argument ever could be. It also explains why people who grew up around unpredictable silence often become hypervigilant adults, constantly scanning new relationships for the earliest warning signs. Let us return now to practical solutions. Because awareness alone is not enough, you also need concrete tools to protect your own peace daily. Sixth, practice self-validation, reminding yourself privately that your need for communication is reasonable, rather than waiting for the silent person to confirm your worth. Write down, if it helps, the specific facts of what happened, separating them clearly from the anxious stories your mind tends to add afterward. This simple practice creates distance between the actual event and the catastrophic interpretation your brain builds during the uncertainty of prolonged, unexplained silence. Seventh, avoid over-explaining yourself repeatedly, since manipulative silence often thrives on your anxious need to justify or clarify things that never needed clarifying. Say what you need to say once, clearly and calmly, then resist the urge to send follow-up messages elaborating further on the same point. Eighth, recognize your own patterns of chasing, because sometimes we chase not out of love, but out of a childhood fear of being abandoned. If chasing silence feels familiar from earlier relationships in your life, that recognition alone can help you respond differently this time around instead. Ninth, decide in advance what you will and will not tolerate, since clarity before conflict is far easier than clarity during the conflict itself. A simple internal rule might sound like this: if a disagreement leads to more than a day of total silence, I will address it directly. 10th, consider therapy specifically trained in attachment and communication patterns, since a professional can help you unlearn responses that no longer serve your well-being. Therapists trained in the Gottman method specifically work with couples to replace stonewalling with structured breaks that include a clear return time agreed upon. This structured break approach allows space without ambiguity, since both people know silence is temporary and communication will resume at an agreed moment. 11th, watch for change over time, since someone willing to grow will eventually replace silence with clearer communication once they understand its impact. Someone unwilling to change, despite repeated conversations about the pattern, is showing you clearly how they intend to handle every future conflict together. This information is valuable, painful as it may be, because it allows you to make decisions based on reality rather than hopeful assumptions. 12th, remember that setting a boundary is not the same as punishing someone back. Boundaries protect you. They are not designed to control them. The goal is never to weaponize silence in return, since matching their tactic only teaches both people that withdrawal is how conflict gets resolved. Instead, the goal is calm, clear, consistent communication, even when the other person refuses to offer the same courtesy back to you in return. This approach protects your own integrity, ensuring that even in a painful dynamic, you are not becoming the very pattern you are trying to heal. Healing from this pattern often takes time, especially if silence was your earliest experience of conflict long before this particular relationship ever began. Be patient with yourself as you unlearn old survival responses, since a nervous system shaped by years of silence does not shift overnight easily. Small progress counts. Noticing the pattern once is progress. Responding differently even one time is progress. Choosing your own peace once is progress too. Surround yourself, where possible, with people who communicate openly, since experiencing healthy conflict resolution can slowly retrain your body to expect safety instead of dread. Over time, you may notice you no longer panic the moment someone goes quiet, because you trust your own ability to handle whatever happens next. This is the quiet transformation that healing brings, not the absence of hard moments, but the presence of steadiness inside those hard moments now. You begin trusting your own perception again, no longer needing someone else's silence or warmth to confirm whether your feelings are valid or not. That shift alone can change every relationship you enter afterward, because you finally stop mistaking someone else's silence for a verdict on your worth. Remember, the people who truly value you will choose words over withdrawal, even when those words are difficult, awkward, or uncomfortable to say aloud. Silence used as connection looks completely different. It feels like rest, not punishment. It feels like safety, not the anxious wait for someone's approval. Learning that difference may be one of the most protective lessons you ever carry into every relationship you build for the rest of your life. And if you have ever been the one reaching for silence yourself, know that awareness is the first step toward choosing a healthier response. It is never too late to replace withdrawal with honest words, even if that honesty feels clumsy or uncomfortable the very first few times. Growth rarely looks graceful in the beginning. It looks like awkward attempts at communication that slowly, with practice, become more natural over time. Whether you have experienced this pattern or recognized it in yourself, the path forward is the same. Choose words, choose clarity, choose connection. If you recognize this pattern in your own relationships, understand that wanting connection and consistency is not needy, it is a basic human need. You are not broken for feeling hurt by silence. Your brain is simply responding exactly the way human brains have been wired to respond. The goal is not to become someone who no longer feels pain from silence. The goal is to stop mistaking that silence for your fault. When you stop chasing an explanation that was never going to be offered, you slowly reclaim the energy that manipulation quietly drained from you. Real connection does not require guessing games. Real connection allows disagreement to be spoken, felt, and resolved without disappearing acts used as leverage instead. Over time, as you practice these responses, the anxious hypervigilance begins to soften because your body learns your worth does not depend on their mood. You start noticing the difference between someone who genuinely needs a pause and someone who uses silence as their default weapon in every conflict. That awareness alone changes how you respond because you are no longer reacting blindly. You are observing the pattern with a clearer, calmer mind. And with that clarity comes something even more valuable: the ability to choose peace for yourself regardless of whether the other person offers it. If this video helped you recognize a pattern from your own life, leave a comment sharing which sign felt the most painfully familiar today. And remember, needing someone to simply talk to you is not weakness, it is the most basic requirement of any honest human relationship overall. If this video gave you a new way to understand the silence you have experienced, please like this video and share it with someone else. Someone out there is currently blaming themselves for another person's chosen silence, and your share might be exactly the clarity they need right now. Thank you for staying with us until this very moment, watching all the way through a topic that touches so many quiet, painful memories. I'm Apex. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next journey into understanding the hidden patterns of human behavior. Goodbye for now, and I will see you again very soon in another exploration of the psychology hiding quietly beneath everyday human interaction.